Welcome back to another episode of Indistinct Chatter. I'm Aliza, and as always, I'm happy to be here filling your brain with, hopefully, interesting facts. I wanted to start with a shout out to my friend Shannon, who sent me a post on Instagram reminding me about the Montauk Project and its relation to Stranger Things for last week's episode. I actually just got off the phone with her, and even though she thought I was talking about mom talk and misspelled it, she is the reason I chose Montauk Project as the theme of last week's episode, so thank you, Shannon. And speaking of Stranger Things, I know. Oh my God, girl, we get it. You like the show. But I'm still going to reference it. Do you remember in season 4 when the entire town is hunting down Eddie because they think he's the serial killing leader of some satanic cult? Well, that wasn't just some random storyline or a made-up scenario per se. In the 80s and 90s, there was something called the Satanic Panic, and some folks even connected Dungeons and Dragons to it. Now, before we get started, a quick content warning. This episode discusses false accusations of child abuse, wrongful imprisonment, and includes mentions of suicide. While the accusations I'll be discussing were ultimately proven false, the topics discussed may still be disturbing or triggering for some listeners. Please be advised and proceed with caution, or feel free to skip this episode. So what is the Satanic Panic? What the hell was going on in the 80s and 90s that had everyone screaming, "It's the devil"? Well, to tell you, we have to do a little time traveling again, okay? You ready? It's September 8th of 1983, and about 200 parents of students of McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, received this letter from local police. It reads, "Dear parent, this department is conducting a criminal investigation involving child molestation. Ray Bucky, an employee of Virginia McMartin's preschool, was arrested September 7th, 1983 by this department. The following procedure is obviously an unpleasant one, but to protect the rights of your children, as well as the rights of the accused, this inquiry is necessary for a complete investigation. Records indicate that your child has been or is currently a student at the preschool. We are asking your assistance in this continuing investigation. Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim. Our investigation indicates that possible criminal acts include oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttock or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of, quote, taking the child's temperature. Also, photos may have been taken of children without their clothing. Any information from your child regarding having ever observed Ray Bucky to leave a classroom alone with a child during any nap period, or if they have ever observed Ray Bucky tie up a child, is important. Please complete the enclosed information form and return it to the department in the enclosed stamped return envelope as soon as possible. We will contact you if circumstances dictate same. We ask you to please keep this investigation strictly confidential because of the nature of the charges and the highly emotional effect it could have on our community. Please do not discuss this investigation with anyone outside of your immediate family. Do not contact or discuss the investigation with Raymond Bucky or any member of the accused defendant's family or employees connected with the McMartin Preschool." And then in all caps, the letter says, "There is no evidence to indicate that the management of Virginia McMartin's preschool had any knowledge of this situation, and no detrimental information concerning the operation of the school has been discovered during this investigation. Also, no other employee in the school is under investigation for any criminal act." Oofda. That's a hard letter to receive. So what do you think happened after 200 parents received this letter in the mail? First, we need to understand that this letter didn't just come up out of nowhere, all willy-nilly. This was 1983, and America was in the grip of the Satanic Panic, a moral panic where people became convinced that secret networks of Satanists were infiltrating daycares, schools, and communities across the country, ritually abusing children. And this panic didn't just one day pop up in the zeitgeist either. So let's back up a little bit further so I can set the scene for you, give you an idea of the vibes. Throughout the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of social change happening. More and more women were joining the workforce and feminism was rising. No-fault divorce laws were spreading in the 70s, making divorce easier, and single-parent households started increasing. The gay rights movement was really picking up with the Stonewall Uprising in June of '69, and Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in 1973. Schools were changing too. Prayer was removed from public school following Engel v. Fatale in 1962, and schools started teaching evolution instead of creationism. Sex education was now teaching about contraception instead of just abstinence. And on top of all of that, porn was more accessible and people were starting to see more violence in movies and sex on TV. Cue the Family Guy theme song. Plus, there was that crazy, wild rock and roll music with all its immoral messaging and drugs and the whole counterculture. Traditionalists were not exactly gung-ho about all of this. I mean, listen to the theme song of All in the Family. Their core belief was that America was a Christian nation founded on biblical principles, and these social changes were taken as more of an attack rather than progression. They felt it was a coordinated attack by liberals to basically destroy Christianity and traditional morality, and someone had to be orchestrating all of this moral decay. Enter Satan and his disciples. Dun, dun, dun. So, with all these changes happening, a perfect combo of fear and anxiety really started brewing across the country. And to play devil's advocate here, for many people, when something is unknown to them or they don't fully understand something, it can get a little bit scary. And folks were letting it get to their heads. I mean, people were jumping to the conclusion that these changes weren't natural and satanic cults were responsible. Seems a little extreme, no? Like, where did that specific idea come from? Like many great or not so great things, it popped off with a book called Michelle Remembers, which was published in 1980 and was written by Dr. Lawrence Pazder, a Canadian psychiatrist, along with his patient Michelle Smith, who had been Pazder's patient since 1973. Things really started to kick off in 76, and during one session in particular, she allegedly screamed for 25 minutes straight and then started speaking in the voice of a 5-year-old. This is when the, quote, memories started coming back. Dr. Pazder said that with recovered memory, as he called it, Michelle claimed to remember that when she was 5, which would have been 1954, 1955, her mother had offered her up to a satanic cult in Victoria, BC. And this was no small shindig of a ritual, people. This wasn't just singing and dancing around a fire, speaking in tongues. This was said to be an 81-day ritual where she was tortured, locked in cages, sexually assaulted, forced to participate in rituals, and even witnessed human sacrifices. She claimed she was rubbed with blood and body parts of sacrificed humans, including infants, and she even said that Satan himself appeared during these rituals. Michelle claimed that Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and the Archangel Michael all intervened, removed her physical scars, and blocked her memories until it was the, quote, right time for her to remember them. So if you're following along, no physical evidence to corroborate her claims, okay? So surely you're probably thinking, okay, but that story seems a bit bonkers. Who would believe something like that, right? People did. And this was largely due to the fact that Dr. Pazder had pretty impressive credentials. He was a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, which meant he was a certified Canadian specialist physician who passed rigorous exams, completed extensive training, and committed to lifelong learning through the college's Maintenance of Certification, or MOC program. Basically, the pinnacle of medical experience. Plus, the book claimed to have been verified by the publisher. Apparently, there were thousands of pages of therapy transcripts and even audio and video recordings of these sessions, which were described as, quote, powerfully convincing. I mean, people wanted to believe that childhood trauma could be recovered this way. Think of what that could mean and what it could do. The book naturally became a bestseller. They received a $100,000 advance for the hardcover and $242,000 for the paperback rights. That's $342,000 before royalties or even the potential movie deal they were working on. Dr. Pazder and Michelle were even featured in People magazine, the National Enquirer, and they did a whole U.S. tour to promote the book. Here's a little hot goss about these two, though. When all this therapy was happening, Michelle and Dr. Pazder were both married to other people. And surprise, surprise, after the book was published, they both got divorced and married each other, which they failed to mention in their book. Pazder's wife even said that the relationship between Michelle and Pazder was what led to their divorce, and that Pazder became emotionally distant from his own children. Now, there was some skepticism from the beginning about their book. There were at least some people with their heads on a little tighter than others. Michelle's father, Jack Proby, denied all the allegations against Michelle's mother, Virginia, who had died in 1964. And Jack said he could refute all the allegations in the book. Also, Michelle had 2 sisters, Cheryl and Tertia, which was also never mentioned in the book. Cheryl even confirmed later on that no abuse had occurred and said the accusations created a huge family rift. The book also references police being called, but no such police reports existed, and Dr. Pazder never reported the alleged abuse to police, which seems odd because he was a mandated reporter. Another person who pointed out some flaws in their story was Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. Anton actually threatened to sue because the book claimed his church was involved, which would have been hard to do because the Church of Satan wasn't even founded until 1966, which was years after these events supposedly happened. So Dr. Pazder had to withdraw that claim. Even scholars like James R. Lewis noted that many of Michelle's claims seemed to be drawn from talk of West African secret societies from the 50s. And guess what? Dr. Pasteur had worked as a missionary in Africa. There was no physical evidence found, no corroboration of any of these events, and the timeline had major red flags. And if you remember in my Montauk Project episode, repressed memories and just memories in general are not exactly credible, especially memories about supernatural beings appearing. A lot of folks theorize that Michelle may have fabricated the entire story, even suggesting it was to spend more time with Dr. Pasteur. Personally, I hate the whole narrative of women being desperate for men's attention, but it's not impossible, you know? Despite the lack of evidence and critics pointing out the flaws in their story, the damage was done. Michelle Remembers made recovered memory therapy seem legit, and it established Dr. Pasteur as an expert. He went on to consult on the McMartin Preschool Trial and tour with something called the Cult Crime Impact Network. Now, here's where I need you to buckle up, okay? Things are going to get a little weird because we need to explore a bit more about how one book could create a nationwide panic and how it got so out of control. Dr. Pasteur didn't just write one book and marry his patient and call it a day. He and a whole bunch of other people, including therapists, law enforcement, and so-called experts, turned this story into an industry. And that industry would destroy lives for the next 15 odd years or so. And the media, of course, the hungry media, ate this shit up. And they made sure no crumbs were left behind. This industry that spawned meant therapists started looking for satanic ritual abuse in their own patients, and they weren't exactly waiting for patients to bring it up on their own. Some therapists at this time were suggesting it by asking leading questions, and some even used hypnosis to try to recover these memories. And recovered memory therapy ended up becoming this huge thing. The idea was that if you experienced trauma as a child, your brain could have buried these memories as a way to protect yourself. But with the help of a therapist, you could dig them back up. Sounds reasonable in theory, but the techniques they were using were quite problematic. Like I said, they'd use hypnosis and ask leading questions like, do you think something might have happened to you that you don't remember? Like, that's an odd question, right? And they'd reassure patients that their feelings proved the abuse happened, even without any actual memories or physical proof. Then there were all these support groups forming for alleged SRA survivors. However, a lot of experts define these support groups as more of a feedback loop rather than a true support group. You get a bunch of people together who all believe in the same thing, so it reinforces that belief and loops back around. Someone hears a story, and suddenly they remember it happening to them too, and so on and so on. Mental health professionals were treating SRA as a legitimate diagnosis, so conferences and support groups focusing on SRA seemed more official. And when things are seemingly official, it seems more credible, right? You see an expert is speaking, and you're like, oh, well, if they're talking about it, it must be true. And speaking of these experts, many were people who claimed to be former Satanists who had escaped and were now trying to warn everyone about the dangers. I mean, of course you're going to listen to what they have to say, right? They had firsthand experience, and they're experts. So let me introduce you to a few of these experts, if you don't mind. First, we have Mike Warnke, who claimed to be a former satanic high priest, wrote a book called The Satan Seller, and went on a bunch of speaking tours. He released a bunch of albums that played widely across Christian radio, and he was even featured on the September 1976 cover of the Christian magazine Harmony, and later appeared on a 2020 episode called The Devil Worshippers. Later on, his entire backstory was proved to be totally made up during an investigation by Cornerstone Magazine. And speaking of Cornerstone Magazine, let me introduce you to Lauren Stratford, which wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Laurel Rose Wilson, and she wrote some books. One was called Satan's Underground, and in it, she claimed her own child was used in a satanic sacrifice. And get this, she even appeared on Oprah in 1989 alongside Michelle Smith. Cornerstone Magazine's expose on Lauren/Laurel showed that her alleged child never even existed, and that the publishers never verified any of her claims. It was revealed in interviews with her family and former associates that she had a long history of mental illness and making false allegations of abuse. Oh, and Lauren/Laurel was briefly involved in the McMartin Preschool Trial. Then we have Rebecca Brown Yoder, who was a former doctor turned Christian evangelist and wrote Prepare for War, a manual for spiritual warfare in 1992. The description of this book even says it will show you how to recognize and deal with satanic ritualistic abuse of children. It also asks, do you know how Satan can use doorways, including yoga, role-playing games, and meditation to bring demonic destruction in your home? Girl, chill. It's not that deep. But the crazy part about her story is that according to a 1992 FBI report, her book was being treated as a reference guide by some law enforcement agencies. We also have radio and television evangelist Bob Larson, who wrote several books criticizing rock music and Satanism. He also had a radio show targeted towards teens where he talked shit about rap and role-playing games. And at the ripe age of 81, he's still popping off with his own podcast and makes appearances on other shows. And I thought this was interesting. Do you remember Skype? Well, Bob offered to perform exorcisms over Skype for just a small donation of $295. Sometimes I think we really do be out here in the Wild West doing things that we really don't need to be doing. Lastly, Jack Chick. Jack was an American cartoonist and publisher, most notably the comics Chick Tracts. In these comics, he accused Roman Catholics, Freemasons, Muslims, and more of murder and other various conspiracies. And crazy enough, even though Jack has passed, his company, Chick Publications, is still going strong. These comics are accredited for shaping the way a lot of evangelical Christians saw Satanism, and his comics are actually housed in the Yale University archives. Crazy, huh? And Chick was not like other girls. Although he wanted to evangelize others after he converted to Christianity, he was all, I'm shy. I'm so shy. So he created a more visual approach, which became his Chick Tracts. Because he was so shy, he wasn't on TV or hosting seminars like these other experts. And some people believed he wasn't even a real person, just a pen name. Mr. Elusive, this guy. Obviously, these aren't the only self-proclaimed experts. There were many, many, many more. But all of these people had one thing in common, aside from the whole Satanism thing. They were all grifters making money. So much money. From speaking engagements to book sales to consulting fees, there's serious cash to be made from scaring people, especially about satanic cults. And what's concerning about all these experts in this whole industry is the fact that law enforcement got involved. There was this whole Cops for Christ thing going on, and even Dr. Pazder gave seminars through the Cult Crime Impact Network where he was training police how to identify satanic crime. Basically, cops would attend these seminars, learn all about Satanism from these so-called experts, go back to their departments, and then present themselves as occult experts. And the gag is, they didn't have any actual expertise. But because they're police, prosecutors and judges took them seriously, and when these cops/expert witnesses would testify in court about satanic symbolism and ritual abuse, juries would believe them because they're cops and they were trained to become experts. And of course, the insatiable media. At the time, talk shows were the worst offenders. Like I mentioned, Oprah even featured Michelle Smith and Lauren Stratford, aka Laurel Rose Wilson. Their stories were presented as fact and not even questioned or skepticized. But Oprah wasn't the only host to feature episodes dealing with SRA allegations or recovered memory therapy or Satanism. Sally Jesse Raphael, Phil Donahue, and Geraldo Rivera did as well, all without skepticism or solid proof. Geraldo, though, actually issued a retraction and apology for the damage that his programs had done to innocent people. So that's something, I guess. I don't know. The damage is done, and although he apologized, he aided in the media frenzy surrounding more than just the satanic panic. This guy runs his mouth a lot. News programs got in on the whole thing too. 2020 and other news magazines did investigations into satanic cults. Local news stations ran these sensationalized stories, and every story validated another. And like most sensationalized news stories, one thing leads to another. More coverage, more allegations, more coverage. It's a self-sustainable news cycle, just pumping out more and more claims without proof or skepticism. Also, this was a time when tabloids were exploding. A little bit of entertainment, a little bit of information, infotainment, if you will. And much like sex, Satan sells. Nobody was fact-checking or demanding evidence. They were just eating these stories up. This was a time where people thought, well, if it's on the news, it must be true. The more and more panic grew and spread, the more people would come forward with their own recovered memories, leading to more coverage, more panic, more memories, more coverage again, around and around and around. So now we're seeing these therapists actively using questionable techniques to find SRA, grifters profiting heavily off their bullshit, law enforcement learning from these grifters and testifying in court as experts, the media constantly circulating more and more absurd stories. And it's all creating this perfect environment for panic and fear just bursting at the seams. And all this panic is what leads us to that letter sent to 200 parents in Manhattan Beach, California in September of 1983 and led to the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history. In August of 1983, a month before the letter was sent out, we're introduced to Judy Johnson. Judy brought her 2-year-old son to the doctor due to him having painful bowel movements. Somehow, Judy convinced herself that her son had been sexually abused at the McMartin Preschool where he was enrolled. Before I get into Judy's accusations, it's important to note that Judy had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which was withheld from the defense for 3 years. And over the course of this investigation, her accusations got wilder and wilder. Initially, Judy accused Ray Buckey, a 25-year-old teacher at the preschool. His mom, Peggy, was an administrator at the school, and his grandmother, Virginia, was the founder of the school. Judy's accusations were that Ray not only sexually abused her son, but that he could also fly. Flying wasn't all. Judy made several more accusations saying that staff at the daycare had engaged in bestiality, and Ray's mom, Peggy, the school's administrator, had, quote, drilled a child under the arms. Her initial claim against Ray Buckey was taken very seriously by the Manhattan Beach Police Department. They arrested Ray on September 7th and then the next day sent out that letter. The police brought in an organization called Children's Institute International to interview children. Key McFarlane conducted these interviews using hand puppets and anatomically correct dolls, believing they would serve as nonverbal communication tools within a play therapy framework in order to explore trauma and promote recovery. That sounds kind of good, right? Only Key wasn't a trained therapist or psychologist. She had a degree in social work and positioned herself as an expert in child abuse. And these techniques used during these interviews were argued by the defense that they were highly suggestive and invited children to pretend or speculate about supposed events rather than actually sharing any experiences of abuse. These interviews were recorded, and when children would, quote, admit to being abused, a cut would be made, and those cuts would be shown to parents to convince them that their child had been abused. He would ask leading questions, praise kids when they said what she wanted to hear, keep pushing if they weren't saying what she wanted to hear, and she'd tell kids their friends had already told her about the abuse, so they should too. Saying nothing happened was absolutely not acceptable. And it's worth noting that children, especially such young children, are incredibly susceptible to suggestion. It's that age where they want to please adults and give the right answer. So when an adult keeps asking you the same thing over and over again, you start to think maybe there is a right answer you're supposed to give, not necessarily your truth. In total, the CII interviewed about 400 children, and Key concluded that an astounding 360 of them had all been abused. That's 90%. Like, hello? Logic, you there? How in the devil's name do 360 children get abused in one preschool without anyone noticing? And at first, these kids were answering with somewhat plausible stories like inappropriate touching. But then the stories escalate pretty quickly, and they reach some pretty wild levels of insanity. Again, these kids were being pushed to admit to sexual assault. A clinical psychologist and professor of psychiatry, Michael P. Maloney, testified saying the interview techniques were improper, coercive, directive, problematic, and adult-directed in a way that forced children to follow a rigid script. He concluded that many of the kids' statements were generated by the examiner. Children would say they were taken through underground tunnels beneath the school or travel in a hot air balloon to other locations to be abused. They said they'd seen animal sacrifices and were forced to drink blood. Teachers had flushed them down toilets into secret rooms, and one child even identified Chuck Norris as one of the abusers. Some kids even said Ray Buckey could fly, just like what Judy Johnson said, and said he dressed as a clown, a policeman, or a fireman to abuse them. One child claimed they'd been taken to a church where they saw witches fly, and another kid said babies were being chopped up in the basement. Multiple allegations included orgies at car washes and airports, and some children spoke of a game called Naked Movie Star, which suggested they were forcibly photographed nude. However, the Naked Movie Star game was actually just a rhyming taunt used to tease other kids and had nothing to do with having naked photos taken. The rhyme was, "What you say is what you are. You're a naked movie star." With each accusation came another, more outlandish accusation. It's that feedback loop I mentioned earlier with support groups. By March of 1984, based on these interviews by the CII, 7 people were arrested and charged with hundreds of counts of child abuse. Ray Buckey, his mother, Peggy McMartin Buckey, his grandmother, Virginia McMartin, and 4 other teachers, including Ray's sister, Peggy Ann, Mary Ann Jackson, Betty Rader, and Babette Spitler. Together, they were charged with 115 counts of child abuse, which later expanded to 320 counts, involving 48 children. Initially, Ray was held without bail, but in 1987, the trial judge granted bail at the low price of $3 million, which Ray was not able to raise. In 1988, the judge gave him a deal and said, hey, how about $1.5 million? So Ray had to stay in jail, unconvicted, for 5 years. Again, the media went bananas over this case. I mean, it had everything you could ever want in a great news cycle: sexual abuse, satanic elements, a preschool, and accusations against multiple people. The news coverage was never ending. Every new detail, every new allegation, all broadcasted and spun as these brave kids coming forward and evil predators being brought to justice. The parents would even tell the news about how their kids had been violated, and the community was convinced that this massive child abuse ring had been operating right under their noses. It got to the point that more and more schools and daycares were being accused of the same thing. Now, before the actual trial even started, there was an 18-month-long preliminary hearing. This is when the court decides if there's enough evidence to even go to trial. They had children testifying during this hearing, and one child that testified saying they'd been abused by Ray at the preschool couldn't even point him out in the courtroom. He actually pointed at the prosecutor instead, which not a great look for the prosecutor. Eventually, charges against 5 out of the 7 were dropped, and the cases against Peggy Ann, Ray's sister, Marianne Jackson, Betty Rader, Babette Spittler, and Virginia McMartin were dropped due to the court's decision that there just wasn't enough evidence. But Ray and his mom remained in custody and faced trial, which began in April of '87 and lasted until January of 1990. And this trial cost over $15 million, all at the taxpayer's expense. The prosecution called 124 witnesses, while the defense only called 11. Many testimonies given by the children were all over the place and constantly contradicted their own stories and other stories. In fact, years later, some of these children, now adults, came forward to say that they'd made things up because they thought that's what the adults wanted to hear. Remember, they were grilled and grilled until the interviewer was pleased with their answer, and she was only pleased with their answer when they said they were abused. So finally, when the trial ended, Ray's mom, Peggy McMartin Bucky, was acquitted on all counts, freeing her of any charges and retrials. And Ray, he was cleared on 52 out of 65 counts, but the jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision. 9 jurors stated in a press conference that they believed the children had been molested, but the evidence didn't allow them to state who had committed the abuse beyond a reasonable doubt. Even without any evidence, it was a hung jury. The prosecution wanted to retry him on 6 out of 13 counts he wasn't acquitted of in the first trial. So there was another trial, which ended in July of 1990. The jury was hung again, but finally the prosecution just gave up. The charges were dismissed and the case was closed. All in all, not so bad, right? I mean, it only took them 7 full-ass years, $15 million in taxpayer money, 400 interviewed children, and just, a bunch of lives destroyed. So let's talk about what this did to those who were accused. Remember, Ray spent 5 years in the slammer before trial even started, before ever even being convicted of committing any crime. Then he spent 2 more years in there during the trials, and even though he was acquitted, his reputation was destroyed. He's even since changed his name. And his mother, Peggy McMartin Bucky, spent 2 years in jail and 5 on trial. Even after her death in 2000, her name was never fully cleared in the public eye. Virginia McMartin, the school's founder, died in 1995 before being vindicated. And the school she built, her life's work, her legacy, was destroyed. Literally, they bulldozed it. Apparently, some parents and private investigators were still trying to find a secret room or tunnels under the school. And when the property sold to a real estate developer in February of 1990 so the McMartin family could cover legal fees, the new owner even allowed folks to dig one last time for evidence before the demo in order to, quote, get it out of their system. The stigma surrounding the allegations remained for Peggy Ann, Marianne, Betty, and Babette, too. It's hard to come back from allegations involving children, even if the allegations were outlandish and ultimately charges dropped. And what about the kids? Can you imagine? Many of them were traumatized by the process itself. Like I mentioned, many came forward to say they'd been pressured into making false accusations, and some of them even said they'd spent years in therapy dealing with memories of abuse that never actually occurred. These poor, innocent babies. They were put through aggressive interviews, which were more like interrogations. They were lied to and told their friends had already said that they were abused, and then they had to say they were too. And can you imagine being a small child and having to testify in court to strangers and lie and say things happened to you when they didn't? And remember Judy Johnson, the woman who started this whole thing with her initial accusation? She actually died in 1986 and never recanted her claims or anything. And the most infuriating thing about all of this, no one faced any real consequences for this shit show. Not the interviewers, not the prosecutors who dragged this out for 7 years without any evidence, not the media outlets who sensationalize every single accusation without evidence or skepticism. The only people who suffered from this were the accused, whose lives and reputations were destroyed, and the kids who were put through this traumatic shit. Ray and his family never received an apology or public acknowledgement that the system failed them catastrophically. And the McMartin Preschool case wasn't the only case. The same pattern was playing out in communities across the nation. I won't get into all of them because honestly, they follow the same tragic pattern: coercive interviews, wild accusations, not having evidence, and ending with lives being destroyed. But if you want to do some digging yourself, try looking up the West Memphis 3 case from 1993, or the Kern County cases, or the Fells Acre Daycare case, or the Little Rascals Daycare cases. It wasn't just schools and daycares being affected by all this panic. The satanic panic spread into music, games, and books. Basically, anything that parents didn't understand became a target. Could you imagine 6-7 being like a satanic thing? Anyway, here's where I get to tell you a little bit about the Dungeons and Dragons of it all. Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game that was originally created and designed by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. The game was first published in 1974, and it's commonly recognized as the beginning of modern role-playing games and the role-playing game industry, which has also deeply influenced various video games. Basically, you create a character, maybe a wizard, maybe an elf, maybe a warrior, and as this character, you go on adventures with your friends who are also playing characters. There's a dungeon master who guides the story/adventure, and you roll a dice to determine various outcomes. It's basically collaborative storytelling where you get to be as imaginative as you want, just in game form. Like, that sounds fun and harmless, right? Well, Patricia Pulling would beg your pardon. In June of '82, Patricia's 16-year-old son Irving Pulling II, also known as Bink, tragically died by suicide in their home in Richmond, Virginia. He died by a self-inflicted shot to his chest, and it's really sad. But Patricia was convinced she knew why, and that was Dungeons & Dragons. Irving had been playing D&D at school, and during one game, his character had been cursed. Patricia became convinced that this fantasy game curse had driven her son to take his own life. She believed that D&D was teaching kids real, legit spells and rituals. It was this gateway to the occult, and it was literally summoning demons. Patricia ended up suing her son's school principal for $1 million, claiming the school allowed D&D to be played, leading to her son's death. Although the suit was dismissed, Patricia wasn't going to just let it go. In 1983, she founded the organization called BAD, which stood for Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. BAD described D&D as a, quote, fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, and other teachings. Over the next decade, she made it her mission to warn America about these dangers related to D&D. She went on speaking tours, appeared on TV, including Oprah and 60 Minutes. She consulted with police departments as one of those experts, and just in general made a career out of claiming D&D was satanic. To her, the proof was in the pudding. The game had magic spells, demons, and references to different gods, proof that it was teaching kids real occultism. And for the record, there was never any evidence that D&D caused suicide or violence. But Patricia's message played right into the satanic panic narrative. Parents were already paranoid about Satan infiltrating society, and now they had to worry about their kids' games. It got to this point that some schools banned D&D, and some parents would burn their kids' game books and dice. It was just another snowball effect fueled by a grieving mother who couldn't accept the fact that sometimes, tragically, teenagers take their lives for complex reasons. Also, adding to the hysteria, there was a TV movie in 1982 starring a young Tom Hanks called Mazes and Monsters. It was based on a novel about a college student who plays a role-playing game like D&D and becomes so obsessed that he can't distinguish fantasy from reality. So, circling back to Stranger Things, if we're keeping score for Eddie, this is his first strike against him. After all, he was the dungeon master of the Hellfire Club. And speaking of, I got a little free sticker in my pizza box, and it's the Hellfire logo. That's right. If you didn't know, you can get your own Surfer Boy pizza at Walmart, and it'll have a little sticker inside waiting for you. They're not loosey-goosey. You have to look inside of the box, and it'll be there. Anyway, D&D wasn't the only target. Let's move on to Eddie's second strike against him: heavy metal music. In the 80s, we had bands like Iron Maiden, Slayer, Judas Priest, Ozzy Osbourne, and many others who were accused of promoting Satanism, violence, and suicide. Album covers had dark imagery, and lyrics could be intense. Kids listening to this music often had parents who grew up listening to Elvis and the Beatles, so quite the difference. 1990, two young men, James Vance and Ray Belknap, had attempted suicide after allegedly listening to Judas Priest's music. Sadly, Ray died and James survived, but he was severely injured. Their families ended up suing the band and claiming their song Better by You, Better Than Me contained subliminal messages telling fans to, quote, do it, as in kill themselves. The case went to trial, and the band had to defend themselves in court against the claims that they'd hidden satanic messaging in their music that made kids kill themselves. Like, be so for real right now. Why would bands want their fans to die? How's that good for longevity in business? Ultimately, the judge ruled in the band's favor due to the lack of any evidence and no proof that music could cause someone to take their own life. But just like with the McMartin Preschool story, the damage was done. People now had this idea that heavy metal was dangerous and satanic. Also, there was this whole backward masking thing going on. People claim that if you played certain rock songs backwards, like Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, you'd hear satanic messages. Who was intentionally listening to records backwards anyway? I mean, I don't know. I heard the drugs were wild back then. But also, is the human brain really that good at finding patterns, even when they're not there or when they're backwards? Well, kind of. It's called pareidolia, which is the psychological phenomenon where the brain perceives patterns, often faces, in random or ambiguous things. Specifically, auditory pareidolia is where we might think we hear distinct words or music in random noise, like running water or white noise, or in this case, hearing distinct words in backwards played music. This all came to a head in 1985 when Mary Elizabeth Atchison, who would later be known as Tipper Gore, second lady and wife of the 45th Vice President Al Gore, co-founded the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC. PMRC's goal was to increase parental control over children's access to music with violent or sexual content. PMRC created the Filthy 15, which was a list of 15 songs they deemed most objectionable. The list included Prince's Darling Nikki, Madonna's Dress You Up, Cyndi Lauper's She Bop, and a bunch of heavy metal songs. They pushed for a rating system kind of like movie ratings, which led to Senate hearings in September of 1985, where musicians like Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, Frank Zappa, and Sweet Angel John Denver testified. Dee Snider showed up in his full rock star getup and gave a very articulate and intelligent defense of artistic freedom. He was pointing out that the PMRC was essentially advocating for censorship. Zappa called it an ill-conceived piece of nonsense, and even sweet baby wholesome John Denver testified about how one of his songs had been banned because someone misinterpreted the lyrics. Can you imagine? I mean, banning art and music and books in general is insane, but John Denver? You wanted to ban John Denver? Get out of here. It all resulted in record labels agreeing to place this cute little sticker on album covers. You know them, the black and white ones that say parental advisory, explicit content. That's right. Those stickers were a product of the Satanic Panic. But if you try to make it so kids can't listen to something, they want to listen to it more. I mean, it's like seeing an R-rated movie for the first time without a parent. As a kid, it's exhilarating. Only the cool kids were watching R-rated movies and listening to music with parental advisory stickers, you know? During the Satanic Panic, people started seeing satanic symbols everywhere. Around this time, Procter & Gamble's logo featured a man-in-the-moon type of face and 13 stars. 13 is already spooky, but people claimed the stars could be arranged to form the numbers 666. The devil's number. But I mean, couldn't you arrange anything to form 666 if you tried hard enough? I also saw that some people say his beard has an inverted 666. The rumors got so out of control that P&G eventually changed their logo in 91 just to shut people up. Now it's the boring blue P&G letters. No personality. Oh my God, I just thought about Liquid Death. Imagine that being released during the Satanic Panic. I think people would have straight up died or gone into a coma. Some people claimed that McDonald's and other corporations were secretly owned by the Church of Satan and putting satanic messaging in their ads. I kind of want some fries and a Diet Coke. And get this, there were rumors that the kindest man on television, the friendliest of neighbors, Mr. Rogers, was a Satanist. Someone started this rumor that he wore sweaters to cover up his satanic tattoos from his time as a Marine sniper. The man never even served in the military, and no tattoos were ever presented, but nevertheless, the rumors persisted. And sweet baby Tinky Winky of the Teletubbies was accused of promoting Satanism and homosexuality simply because his character was purple, carried a purse, and had a triangle on his head. You know, typical satanic gay stuff. The satanic panic made people see threats everywhere. It was a time where if you didn't understand something, or if it was new or different or aimed at younger people, it's the devil's doing. So now, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, we've had daycare workers in prison, teens being targeted because of their clothing and music choices. Again, look up the West Memphis 3. We've seen bands being sued, boycotts over brand logos, just absolutely out of control shit. But moral panics don't last forever, right? Eventually, reality has to break through to people. It's got to unravel and end, right? Well, in 1992, something important happened. And it wasn't just the arrival of yours truly. The FBI released a report called The Investigator's Guide to Allegations of Ritual Child Abuse, written by Supervisory Special Agent Kenneth Lanning. Kenneth had been studying allegations of SRA for years, and he was pretty straightforward with his conclusion, which was that there was no evidence of widespread satanic cults. Kenneth investigated these claims thoroughly by looking at patterns, interviewing law enforcement, examining the evidence or lack thereof, and what he found was that despite thousands of allegations, countless hours of media coverage, and a bunch of experts, aka grifters, claiming there were organized satanic networks abusing children, no one could produce any actual proof. This is all giving major Pizzagate vibes. You remember that crazy-ass story? Anyway, Kenneth wrote that after his investigation, he couldn't identify even one case where a child had been ritually sacrificed by a satanic cult. His report was the one I briefly pointed out earlier, with books like Rebecca Brown's Prepare for War being used as reference guides by law enforcement. And he basically said, hey, maybe we shouldn't be treating unverified claims from people with no expertise as fact. Just a thought. What do you think? Well, the people who believed in the whole satanic conspiracy weren't convinced. They claimed the report was part of the cover-up and that the FBI was either incompetent or in on it. That's what happens with conspiracies. Once they've expanded past just a few people scrutinizing or blaming something for something else, any evidence against the conspiracy just becomes part of the conspiracy. At least the conversation started shifting, and law enforcement and legal professionals were willing to listen to actual evidence. And around this time, scientists and psychologists were starting to speak up about the problems associated with recovered memory therapy. Remember, memories aren't the most reliable, especially recovered memories. Elizabeth Loftus, who has a PhD in mathematical psychology and is most notably known for her criticism of recovered memory therapies, published studies showing how easy it is to implant false memories in people. She demonstrated that through suggestion, leading questions, and repeated interrogation, you could make people remember things that never happened. Is this gaslighting? I think I finally have a better understanding of what gaslighting means. Yay! The more you know! Elizabeth's research showed that memory is not like a video recording that you can just rewind and play back. It's reconstructive. Every time you remember something, you're essentially rebuilding that memory, and it can be influenced by suggestion, your current beliefs, things other people have told you, and even your own imagination. And this was huge. It undermined the entire foundation of recovered memory therapy. Finally, people were seeing that if memories can be implanted, then maybe all those recovered memories of satanic abuse might not be memories at all. Professional organizations started issuing warnings, and the American Psychological Association cautioned against recovered memory techniques. The American Medical Association raised concerns, and the scientific community in general was essentially saying, yo, this recovered memory shit is not scientifically valid. So as more and more scientific evidence mounted and Kenneth's FBI report circulated, the legal system started to finally correct course. Convictions were being overturned. People who had spent years in prison for crimes that never happened were finally being released. Lawsuits were filed against therapists who had used recovered memory techniques, and some even lost their licenses. Insurance companies even started to refuse coverage for recovered memory therapy because of the liability. There were also changes in how children were interviewed in relation to abuse cases. New protocols were put in place that emphasized non-leading questions, proper documentation, and involving actual child psychology experts, not just people who said they were. Basically, the McMartin Preschool case, with its hefty price tag and wasted time, became a cautionary tale in law schools. It became an example of how the system can fail when emotions override evidence. With all this emerging, the satanic panic finally faded. It didn't go away, obviously, but it faded. Trends weren't as short-lived as they are now, so it took until the mid-90s for people to move on to new fears. Stranger danger became the new hot concern, this whole idea that predators were everywhere waiting to snatch children. And I don't know if this was a generational thing or if it was just me, but did anyone else who grew up in like late 90s, early 2000s have a deep fear of being kidnapped? I remember we'd be watching America's Most Wanted and I would convince myself that the killer was outside watching me watch him, and now he had to take me and kill me. And I feel like I even remember hearing about Elizabeth Smart in school a lot. Anyway, other fears were emerging in the 90s, like the internet and online predators, then school shootings. Eventually, all that satanic shit was starting to become increasingly implausible. As more and more people were released from prison as a result of these cases being overturned or dropped, it became harder to maintain the narrative that all these people were guilty. A different snowball effect, if you will. With each new exoneration, credibility chipped away, and so did the panic. Most people were moving on. There were other fish to fry, and for a while it seemed like maybe we'd learned something from all this. Maybe we'd be more skeptical and use some critical thinking and logic next time. Maybe we'd use some of that common sense I'm always hearing about and demand evidence before ruining someone's life. Spoiler alert, we didn't learn one damn thing, people. It's 2025 and there are still some wacky things going down, same patterns playing out. During the 2016 presidential election cycle, a conspiracy theory started spreading online that claimed Democratic officials were running a child trafficking ring out of a pizza restaurant in DC. People claimed that they had found coded messages and leaked emails, and they started analyzing photos on social media and claimed to see evidence everywhere in the restaurant's logo, the artwork on the walls, in social media posts. Sound familiar? Pizzagate believers saw pedophile codes in everything. In December 2016, a man walked into Comet Ping Pong with an AR-15 because he believed children were being held in the basement for a trafficking ring, and he opened fire. Luckily, no one was hurt, and there was no basement or children to be rescued. Just pizza. Then, in 2017, a conspiracy theory and political movement called QAnon emerged on 4chan, which is an anonymous message board where people post some of the most truly unhinged shit. QAnon claimed that there's a secret cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles running the world. Sounding familiar still? They said these pedophiles are in government, in Hollywood, positions of power, and that they're trafficking children and performing ritualistic abuse. And just like during the Satanic Panic, people believed it. Millions of people. They saw evidence everywhere. You remember the Wayfair conspiracy? The Save the Children movement got co-opted by conspiracy theorists. It got to the point that legitimate organizations were trying to fight actual child trafficking and now had to deal with QAnon believers hijacking their hashtags and spreading wild conspiracies instead of actually helping any of the children. Then when people started getting arrested for QAnon-related crimes, when the predicted day of reckoning never came, and when none of the conspiracies panned out, believers didn't stop believing. The goalposts were just moved, and they'd say it was part of the plan. Evidence was being suppressed, and anyone who questioned them was part of the cover-up. They say fashion always cycles around, and I think the same can be said about moral panics. The time changes, and some methods change, but the base of it is still all the same. Child abuse and child trafficking are both very real, very serious problems that deserve our attention, but in both the Satanic Panic and QAnon, people took real concern and turned it into a fantasy that actually made it harder to address the real problem. In the 80s, we had the experts, aka grifters, and today it's anonymous internet posts and social media influencers claiming they've, quote, done the research, but none of them have actual expertise while still speaking with such authority that people believe them. That'd be like me telling you I'm an expert on SRA and conspiracies at this point just because I spent a few days reading online articles. In the 80s, it was all about talk shows amplifying stories without fact-checking. Today, it's social media algorithms pushing the most sensational content to the top of your feed. And once you believe in the conspiracy, everything else confirms it. The logo, an Instagram post, an interpretation of a leaked email, all proof. Remember, the human brain is really good at finding patterns even when they're not there. Ray Bucky's family's lives were ruined based on zero evidence, and today, small business owners are being harassed and threatened because conspiracy theorists decide their business was a front for trafficking. And if you questioned the SRA allegations, you were accused of being a pedophile or covering for pedophiles. And today, if you question QAnon, it's the same thing. So what should we have learned from all of this? First, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone's claiming there's a massive underground network of satanic cults or pedophile rings, that's an extraordinary claim and should require solid, verifiable evidence. Testimonies from children who were aggressively interrogated isn't evidence, and neither are cryptic internet posts or your feelings about a logo. Second, question the experts. Who are the people claiming expertise? Do they have credentials? How qualified are they? We shouldn't believe someone just because they're on TV or have massive followers or speak with a ton of confidence. Question them. Third, be skeptical of your own pattern-seeking brain. Remember, we are hardwired to find patterns. It's what kept our ancestors alive. But just because something seems sus doesn't mean it is. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Coincidences happen. Fourth, real problems get ignored when we chase fantasies. Do you know what happened while everyone was chasing underground tunnels that didn't exist? Real child abuse, and it was being ignored. The same thing is happening now. While people chase conspiracies, real trafficking happens out in the open and no one notices because we're all looking in the wrong places. Fifth, once you destroy someone's reputation, you can't really undestroy it. Those accused of SRA at the McMartin Preschool have their reputations, businesses, peace of mind, and years of their lives destroyed, even though they were acquitted of all charges. Remember, Ray had to change his name, and the kids were traumatized by the entire process. We need to be really careful before we ruin someone's life based on allegations. And lastly, the system can fail. Big time. The McMartin Preschool case showed us that when emotion overrides evidence and institutions fail to apply critical thinking, innocent people go to prison. The legal system, the mental health system, law enforcement, the media, they all failed. We need checks and balances and people willing to say, hold up, show me the Carfax. All this to say, the Satanic Panic wasn't even that long ago. Many people who lived through it are still around, and some are still in prison dealing with the consequences. Yet, here we are repeating history. We'll always be susceptible to this kind of panic. It's a very contagious fear, and when we're anxious about social change or worried about our children or just generally scared about the state of the world, we're vulnerable to simple explanations, even when those explanations are completely out of this world. And that's all I have for you today on the Satanic Panic, a cautionary tale about what happens when fear overrides evidence and when we forget to ask for proof. I hope I didn't scare you too much. Don't forget to seek evidence, question sources, use your cute lumpy brain, and remember that real problems deserve real solutions. Fantasies can wait, okay? We'll chat next week. Until then, love ya, love you, bye.